the 19th of June, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. The water lies calm, deceptively peaceful, stretching endlessly in all directions like a sheet of hammered bronze. Aboard the carrier Shokaku, Lieutenant Sake Yamamoto adjusts his leather flight cap and draws a slow breath. The salt air fills his lungs. Around him, mechanics swarm over the wings of his Mitsubishi. A 6M0, their hands moving with practiced urgency. The deck vibrates beneath his boots as engines cough to life, one after another, a mechanical chorus that drowns out the morning birds. He glances at his watch. They are already behind schedule. The strike force should have launched an hour ago, but fuel logistics and coordination delays have pushed everything back. Yamamoto knows what this means. Surprise, that most precious commodity in naval warfare, has already begun to slip through their fingers like water. Yet orders are orders. The Imperial Japanese Navy has committed everything to this operation. 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the accumulated might of a dying empire. Yamamoto climbs into his cockpit, settles into the worn seat that still smells faintly of oil and sweat, and waits for the launch signal. He does not yet know that he is about to fly into the most lopsided aerial slaughter in the history of modern warfare. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would become many things to many people. To American naval commanders, it would be vindication proof that years of industrial mobilization, pilot training, and tactical evolution had created an unstoppable war machine. To the surviving Japanese aviators, it would be a nightmare from which their naval air arm would never awaken. To historians, it would be remembered by a nickname so casual, so brutally dismissive, that it would forever encapsulate the grotesque imbalance of that 2-day engagement, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the roots of this catastrophe stretch back far beyond that June morning. They wind through the smoking wreckage of Pearl Harbor, through the desperate carrier duels at Coral Sea and Midway, through the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, where Japan bled its veteran pilots drop by drop into the blue Pacific. By the summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a crisis that no amount of courage or Bushido spirit could solve. Its carriers still floated, its hangars still held aircraft. But the men who had once made the Zero the terror of the Pacific sky were gone, replaced by boys with barely 2 months of flight training, teenagers who struggled to land on a carrier deck in calm seas, let alone execute a coordinated strike under fire. The Americans, by contrast, had transformed themselves into something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Their industrial base, untouched by enemy bombs, churned out carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The Essex-class fleet carriers rolled down the slipways like automobiles on an assembly line, each one displacing 30,000 tons, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one equipped with radar systems that could detect incoming raids at 70 miles. By June 1944, Task Force 58 fielded 15 carriers, 7 fast battleships, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers so numerous that Japanese scouts could scarcely believe their own reports. But numbers alone do not explain what happened in the Philippine Sea. The true American advantage lay in something less tangible, more devastating: time. Time to train pilots until carrier landings became second nature. Time to develop tactics, to learn from mistakes, to build a doctrine of coordinated fighter direction that turned raw technology into lethal efficiency. Time to equip every fighter with the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a aircraft specifically designed to kill Zeros, with armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 650 caliber machine guns that could shred an enemy plane in a 2-second burst. The Japanese had no such luxury. Every day, American submarines tightened the noose around Japan's oil supply. Every week, another veteran pilot died in some nameless skirmish over a forgotten atoll. The Imperial Navy's carrier fleet had become a beautiful facade concealing a rotten core. Lieutenant Yamamoto did not think in such strategic terms as his Zero roared down Shokaku's flight deck and clawed into the morning sky. He thought about fuel management, about maintaining formation, about the American task force reported somewhere to the east. Intelligence suggested the Americans had perhaps 6 carriers in the area. The actual number was 15, but Yamamoto would never learn this. Around him, the Japanese strike force assembled with agonizing slowness. Nearly 70 aircraft circled and circled, waiting for stragglers, burning precious fuel with every passing minute. The delays compounded. What should have been a coordinated dawn strike launched at 0830, then 0900, then finally staggered out across the morning in ragged waves. American radar picked them up at 0959 hours, while they were still 150 miles out. The elegant Japanese plan to catch the American carriers in port at the Marianas, or failing that, to achieve tactical surprise through speed and coordination, had already collapsed before a single shot was fired. Aboard the carrier Lexington, the Combat Information Center erupted in controlled urgency. Radar operators watched the green phosphorescent blips multiply on their scopes like a spreading infection. Fighter direction officers barked coordinates into their headsets. On the flight deck above, Hellcats launched in smooth succession, their powerful Pratt & Whitney engines propelling them upward at climb rates the older Wildcats could never match. Commander David McCampbell, the Essex Air Group commander, led his fighters toward the intercept point with the calm precision of a man who had done this a dozen times before. The Americans did not scramble in panic. They did not improvise. They executed a doctrine refined through 2 years of hard combat: establish a layered defense, vector fighters to optimal intercept points, hit the enemy bombers before they reach weapons release range, then mop up survivors on their way out. It was industrial warfare applied to aerial combat, and it was about to demonstrate its terrible efficiency. The Japanese pilots expected resistance. What they encountered was annihilation. The first wave ran headlong into a wall of Hellcats 40 miles from the American fleet. Yamamoto saw them coming, dark specks resolving into shark-nosed fighters that dove out of the sun with terrifying speed. The Americans had altitude, they had numbers, and they had been vectored to perfect intercept positions by shipboard radar. Within minutes, the careful Japanese formation disintegrated into a desperate melee. Zeros twisted and turned, their legendary maneuverability suddenly irrelevant against pilots who refused to dogfight, who used superior speed and diving attacks to strike and disengage before the Japanese could react. Yamamoto got one burst at a passing Hellcat, saw his tracers fall hopelessly behind, then felt his Zero shudder as 50 caliber rounds punched through his left wing, fabric ripped, control cables snapped. He fought the stick, managed to stabilize, and broke off toward a cloud bank. Around him, aircraft fell burning from the sky like autumn leaves. Some exploded in mid-air, their unarmored fuel tanks igniting in orange fireballs. Others spun down, trailing smoke, their teenage pilots already dead at the controls. A few survived long enough to ditch in the ocean, where they would float for hours before succumbing to exposure or sharks. Almost none reached the American carriers. The statistics would later reveal the magnitude of the disaster. Of the 69 aircraft in that first wave, the Americans destroyed 42 before they ever saw the fleet. The survivors pressed on with suicidal determination, boring through curtains of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a maelstrom of black puffs and red tracers. American battleships and cruisers fired their 5-inch guns in radar-directed barrages, creating box patterns of exploding shells that shredded anything unlucky enough to fly through them. The newer proximity-fused shells detonated automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby, transforming each round into a miniature fragmentation bomb. One Japanese dive bomber pilot, Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Tanaka, somehow survived the fighter screen and the anti-aircraft barrage long enough to line up on the carrier bunker hill. He pushed over into his attack dive, felt his aircraft accelerate toward terminal velocity, centered his bomb sight on the carrier's island superstructure. Then a proximity shell burst 20 feet off his left wing, and his dive bomber simply disintegrated. The bomb fell harmlessly into the sea. Bunker Hill never altered course. Aboard Lexington, sailors watched the slaughter with a mixture of awe and horror. One young gunner's mate would later write home, "They just kept coming, one after another, and we just kept shooting them down. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't glorious. It was like swatting flies, except the flies were men, and they were burning. This was the cognitive dissonance at the heart of the Turkey Shoot, the uncomfortable realization that industrial superiority had transformed combat into something closer to systematic extermination than warfare. The Japanese pilots displayed courage that bordered on the superhuman. They flew outdated aircraft with inadequate training into overwhelming defenses, and they did so because their culture and their commanders demanded it. But courage without competence, without adequate equipment, without realistic tactics, courage alone could not overcome the crushing material advantages arrayed against them. The Americans had built a system, and that system was optimized for exactly this scenario. The second Japanese strike wave fared even worse. Launched 90 minutes behind the first, it flew into a buzzsaw of American fighters that had already tasted blood. The F-6F Hellcat pilots had climbed back to altitude, refueled from orbiting tanker planes, and established fresh combat air patrols along the most likely approach vectors. The Japanese formation, already ragged from the rushed launch, encountered the Americans 60 miles out and simply fell apart. Ensign Akira Watanabe, flying a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, watched in mounting horror as the Zeros that were supposed to escort his strike group vanished one by one. A Hellcat flashed past, guns blazing. Watanabe's wingman exploded, just vanished in a ball of flame so sudden that Watanabe barely registered it. Another bomber ahead of him, nosed over, smoking. Its pilot slumped dead in the cockpit. Watanabe armed his bomb and pushed his throttle forward, diving for the wave tops where he might find concealment in the haze. He never made it. A Hellcat from Yorktown caught him in a shallow dive, walked a stream of 50 caliber rounds from tail to nose, and Watanabe's bomber cartwheeled into the Pacific at 200 knots. The impact killed him instantly, long before the water flooded his cockpit. By noon, the Japanese had launched 4 separate strike waves, throwing nearly 373 aircraft at the American fleet. The results defied belief. Only a handful of Japanese planes penetrated the defenses, and those that did scored minimal damage, a near miss on the battleship South Dakota. Minor splinter damage to a few destroyers, nothing that affected operational capability. Against this, the Americans destroyed 243 Japanese aircraft. The kill ratio exceeded 10-1, a disparity so extreme that post-war analysts would spend decades studying it, trying to understand how professional militaries could diverge so completely in effectiveness. The answer lay in details that commanders rarely discuss in official reports. It lay in the American pilot who had logged 800 hours of flight time before seeing combat, versus the Japanese pilot with 60 hours total. It lay in the American mechanics, who kept 90% of their aircraft operational through industrialized logistics and pre-positioned spare parts, versus Japanese maintainers who cannibalized 3 planes to keep one flying. It lay in the American radar operator who guided fighters to within visual range of the enemy, versus Japanese formations that navigated by dead reckoning and often missed the American fleet entirely. Lieutenant Yamamoto survived the first wave, though his damaged Zero could barely maintain altitude. He nursed his dying aircraft westward, away from the slaughter, coaxing every mile from his remaining fuel. The left aileron no longer responded. The cockpit reeked of hydraulic fluid. Behind him, the Philippine Sea had become a graveyard. The ocean surface was littered with debris wing panels, fuel slicks, bits of fuselage that caught the afternoon sun and glittered like scattered coins. Yamamoto did not look back. He focused on flying, on breathing, on the distant hope that he might reach friendly territory before his engine quit. He thought about the pre-war days when he had trained over the snow-capped peaks of Hokkaido, when the Zero was new and invincible, when American pilots were dismissed as soft and undisciplined. Those certainties had died somewhere over the Philippine Sea, though Yamamoto could not yet articulate what had replaced them. He felt only a bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping realization that the war he thought he was fighting no longer existed. The Americans knew they had achieved something extraordinary even as the battle unfolded. Pilots returning to their carriers babbled excitedly about the easy kills, the helpless enemy formations, the sky full of burning Zeros. Some felt elation, others felt a vague unease. a sense that they had participated in something less like combat than industrial slaughter. Commander McCampbell, who shot down 7 aircraft that day, landed back on Essex and delivered his after-action report in clipped professional tones. But in his personal diary that night he would write, "We massacred them. I have never seen anything like it. It was not a battle. It was an execution." This tension between professional satisfaction and moral discomfort would haunt many American veterans in later years. They had done their duty with extraordinary skill, yet the lopsided nature of the victory robbed it of the clean narrative of honorable combat between equals. The second day of the battle brought even greater catastrophe for the Japanese. While the air battle raged, American submarines prowled beneath the surface, hunting the Japanese carrier force. The submarine Albacore found the carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and largest fleet carrier, and put a single torpedo into her hull. The damage seemed manageable, one hit, minimal flooding, flight operations continued, but aviation fuel vapors leaked into the ship's ventilation system. Inexperienced damage control crews, rushed through training like the pilots, failed to recognize the danger. 6 hours after the torpedo hit, Taiho became a floating bomb. A single spark, possibly from an electric motor, ignited the fuel vapors. The explosion tore the carrier apart from the inside, blowing out her sides and lifting the flight deck like a child's toy. She sank in minutes, taking over 1,000 men down with her. Later that same afternoon, the submarine Kavala torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, the same ship from which Yamamoto had launched that morning. 3 torpedoes struck her port side, rupturing fuel tanks and igniting fires that overwhelmed her fire suppression systems. She burned for 3 hours, listing steadily, her crew abandoning ship as flames consumed the hangar deck. Then her magazines detonated, and she simply ceased to exist, obliterated in a pillar of smoke and flame visible for 30 miles. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Fifth Fleet, watched the battle reports accumulate with grim satisfaction. He had been criticized earlier in the war for excessive caution, for letting the Japanese fleet escape after Midway. But here, in the Philippine Sea, his methodical approach had created the conditions for total victory. He had positioned his carriers to defend the Marianas invasion force, forcing the Japanese to attack on American terms through American defenses into American radar coverage. The Japanese had no choice but to accept battle at brutal disadvantage or abandon the Marianas entirely. They had chosen battle, and that choice destroyed them. On the evening of June 19, Spruance made a controversial decision. Against the advice of his more aggressive subordinates, he refused to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet westward that night. He would not risk his carriers in a night surface action, would not chase beyond his own land-based air cover. The decision likely saved Japanese lives, allowing more of their crippled fleet to escape, but it also reflected a cold strategic calculus. Why risk American lives hunting a beaten enemy when that enemy had already been rendered operationally irrelevant? The pursuit came the next day, June 20, when American scout planes finally located the retiring Japanese fleet at extreme range. Spruance launched a massive strike in late afternoon, 216 aircraft flying westward into the setting sun. The strike found the Japanese carriers at the edge of their range, low on fuel, racing the clock against darkness and empty tanks. The American pilots pressed their attacks with desperate urgency, knowing they would be landing back on their carriers after dark, many with dry fuel tanks. They sank one more carrier, the Hayo, and damaged several others, but the cost was steep. On the return flight, aircraft began running out of fuel and ditching in the dark ocean. Pilots nursed their engines, leaned their fuel mixtures to the ragged edge, and prayed. Some made it, others did not. 80 American aircraft were lost that night, most to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy action. Yet even this partial disaster illustrated the gulf between the two navies. American destroyers and submarines mounted elaborate search and rescue operations, plucking downed pilots from the water through the night. 76 of the 80 aircrews were recovered and returned to duty. The Japanese, by contrast, routinely abandoned downed pilots. They lacked the resources, the logistics, the cultural framework for large-scale combat rescue. A Japanese pilot who ditched at sea was simply lost, written off, mourned perhaps, but not actively sought. Lieutenant Yamamoto never returned to his carrier. His Zero ran out of fuel 200 miles east of Guam. He ditched in the ocean, survived the impact, and climbed into his inflatable life raft. For 2 days he drifted under the merciless sun, rationing his water canteen, watching the empty horizon. He thought about his family in Hiroshima, about the cherry blossoms that would be blooming now in the temple gardens. He thought about the war, about how everything they had been promised, the quick victories, the collapse of American will, the negotiated peace had turned to ash. On the 3rd day, a fever took hold, probably from infected wounds he had not noticed during the adrenaline of combat. He slipped in and out of consciousness, hallucinating conversations with his dead squadron mates. On the 4th day, he stopped moving. An American patrol plane spotted his raft a day later, but by then Yamamoto was gone, one more name on a casualty list that Tokyo would never fully reconcile. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot shattered the combat effectiveness of Japanese naval aviation beyond any hope of recovery. The Imperial Navy had committed virtually every trained pilot and serviceable aircraft to this operation, gambling everything on a decisive victory that would halt the American advance. Instead, they had flown into a meat grinder that consumed their air groups wholesale. Post-battle assessments revealed the grotesque arithmetic of attrition. Japan lost 3 carriers sunk, 2 damaged beyond quick repair, and approximately 600 aircraft and pilots. American losses totaled approximately 120 aircraft, mostly to operational causes, and 76 pilots. Even accounting for American numerical superiority, the exchange ratio was catastrophic for Japan. But the numbers alone do not capture the qualitative impact. The Japanese had lost not just aircraft, but the irreplaceable core of experienced pilots who might have trained the next generation. The institutional knowledge of carrier operations, accumulated through years of peacetime training and early war successes, died in the Philippine Sea. What remained was a hollow force, carriers with no air groups, veterans with no students, a navy that increasingly existed on paper rather than in combat capability. The Americans, meanwhile, had validated every element of their systematic approach to modern warfare. Their intelligence services had provided accurate strategic warning of Japanese intentions. Their codebreakers had read Japanese naval communications, providing insights into enemy plans and dispositions. Their industrial base had delivered the ships, aircraft, and weapons in overwhelming quantities. Their training pipeline had produced pilots with the skills to exploit their technological advantages. And their tactical doctrine had integrated all these elements into a coherent system that turned favorable conditions into decisive victory. The Turkey Shoot demonstrated that modern naval warfare had evolved beyond individual heroism or tactical brilliance. Victory belonged to the side that could field, sustain, and effectively employ industrial-scale military forces. The Japanese understood war as a test of will and spirit, arena where cultural superiority and fighting ardor could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans understood war as a production problem, an engineering challenge to be solved through logistics, technology, and organizational efficiency. In the Philippine Sea, these philosophies collided, and the outcome was never in doubt. There was a symbolic object that recurred in American accounts of the battle, mentioned in letters home, in after-action reports, in the memoirs written decades later: the turkey. Not the wild turkey of American forests, but the domesticated bird, raised on industrial farms, fattened for slaughter, offering no resistance as it was herded to its fate. The nickname Turkey Shoot was coined by pilots themselves, probably within hours of the battle's end, and it stuck because it captured something essential about the encounter. Turkeys do not fight back effectively. They panic, they scatter, they die in large numbers without inflicting reciprocal casualties. The comparison was cruel, even dehumanizing, but also grimly accurate. The Japanese pilots had been sent into combat conditions that made effective resistance almost impossible. They were turkeys, not because they lacked courage, but because their commanders had placed them in a situation where courage was irrelevant, where systemic advantages overwhelmed individual virtue. The nickname would later cause discomfort, particularly among veterans who remembered the burning aircraft and the men inside them. But it endured because it spoke to a larger truth about industrial warfare, that victory in modern combat often resembles slaughter more than fair fight, that overwhelming superiority transforms battle into something darker and less honorable than traditional martial narratives admit. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had strategic consequences that rippled outward like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Most immediately, it secured the Marianas invasion, allowing American forces to capture Saipan, Tinian, and Guam without interference from Japanese naval aviation. These islands would become the launching points for B-29 superfortress raids against the Japanese home islands, bringing the war directly to Tokyo's industrial heartland. More broadly, the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation meant that subsequent American offensives, the invasion of the Philippines, the assault on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, proceeded without serious threat from enemy carriers. The Imperial Navy still had surface combatants, still had submarines, but it had lost the ability to project power across oceanic distances. The Turkey Shoot marked the functional end of carrier warfare in the Pacific. Future battles would be asymmetric affairs. Japanese desperation attacks against overwhelming American power. Kamikaze tactics employed precisely because conventional naval aviation no longer existed as a viable option. For the Japanese High Command, the defeat precipitated a crisis of confidence from which the Navy never recovered. Admiral Ozawa, who commanded the Japanese carrier force, took full responsibility for the disaster. But responsibility without remedy is merely an exercise in honor. The Navy had no answer to the American combination of radar, superior aircraft, and massive training pipelines. Some officers advocated for new superweapons, for rocket-powered interceptors or jet fighters that might restore tactical balance. But Japan lacked the industrial capacity, the fuel supplies, the rare metals, the technical expertise to develop and deploy such systems at scale. Others argued for shifting resources to submarine warfare, to defensive operations, to conserving forces for a final decisive battle in home waters. But these were the arguments of defeated men, rearguard actions in a war already lost. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the Philippine Sea disaster, reportedly asked his naval aide a simple question: "Can we win?" The aide had no answer. The silence spoke volumes. The American public received news of the Turkey Shoot with jubilation, tempered by ignorance of its full implications. War correspondents reported a great naval victory, a devastating blow to Japanese carrier power, further evidence of American military superiority. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. Families with sons in the Pacific felt relief that the war might end sooner, but few Americans understood the methodical, industrial nature of their victory, or what it revealed about modern warfare. They imagined heroic dogfights, individual pilots matching skill against skill. The reality was more complex and less romantic, a system defeating another system. Industrial capacity, overwhelming martial tradition, a Turkey Shoot. The pilots themselves rarely discussed this cognitive dissonance with civilians. How could they explain that they felt simultaneously proud of their professionalism and vaguely disturbed by the one-sided nature of the killing? That they had done exactly what they were trained to do, and that the ease of it somehow diminished rather than enhanced the satisfaction of victory. In the years after the war, Japanese survivors of the Philippine Sea battle struggled to reconcile their experiences with the national narrative of honorable defeat. Many never spoke of it, burying the memories of that June day beneath decades of silence. Those who did speak tended to focus on the courage of their comrades, the beauty of the morning before the battle, the technical failures and material shortages that had doomed them, rather than any failures of will or skill. This was psychologically necessary, perhaps, a way to preserve dignity in the face of overwhelming defeat. But it also obscured important lessons about the nature of modern warfare, about the dangers of institutional delusion, about the terrible cost of committing young men to battles they cannot possibly win. Lieutenant Yamamoto, drifting in his life raft, had begun to grasp these truths in his final days. He understood that the war was lost not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because courage alone could not overcome radar, could not outproduce American shipyards, could not substitute for the thousands of training hours that turned raw recruits into skilled aviators. His understanding died with him, one more voice silenced before it could warn of the catastrophe still to come. The technological dimension of the Turkey Shoot deserves particular emphasis because it foreshadowed the character of late 20th century warfare. The American victory was fundamentally a triumph of systems integration of radar, providing early warning, of fighter direction, officers vectoring interceptors to optimal positions, of proximity-fused shells, creating impassable barriers of flak, of superior aircraft carrying sufficient firepower to destroy targets in single passes. No single technology was decisive. The Japanese had radar too, though cruder and less reliable. They had capable aircraft designs, though progressively outmatched as the war progressed. What they lacked was the systematic integration of multiple technologies into a coherent doctrine backed by the industrial base to produce these systems in quantity and the training pipeline to operate them effectively. The Americans had created a network of human operators and electronic systems and tactical procedures, all working in concert that was far more than the sum of its parts. The Japanese still fought as a collection of individual elements, pilots and ships and weapons operating in loose coordination. The Turkey Shoot demonstrated that in modern warfare, the integrated system defeats the collection of parts, regardless of individual prowess. As the sun set on the 20th of June, 1944, and the surviving American aircraft limped back to their carriers through the darkness, the Philippine Sea lay quiet once more. The oil slicks had dispersed, the debris fields had drifted, the bodies of young men, Japanese and American alike, floated in the swells or rested on the ocean floor 3 miles down. The water remembered nothing, the sky held no record of the slaughter it had witnessed. Yet something had changed, some fundamental balance had shifted. The Turkey Shoot had demonstrated beyond any doubt that the war's outcome was no longer in question, only its duration. Japan's strategic position was hopeless. Its navy had been broken, its air forces consumed, its merchant fleet hunted to near extinction by American submarines. Only the calendar remained uncertain, the months or years of additional suffering before the inevitable end. Some American commanders, studying the battle reports, allowed themselves to imagine that the Japanese might now sue for peace, that the obvious futility of continued resistance might prompt rational calculation. But this revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of Japanese military culture, of the institutional imperatives that drove decisions in Tokyo. Japan would fight on, not because its leaders believed they could win, but because surrender was unthinkable, because cultural norms dictated resistance to the end, because no one in the power structure possessed the authority or will to admit defeat. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot stands as one of history's most lopsided military engagements, a battle so one-sided that it challenges conventional narratives about warfare. We prefer to imagine combat as a test, a proving ground where courage and skill determine outcomes. But the Turkey Shoot revealed a darker truth, that industrial modernity had transformed war into something closer to systematic annihilation, where victory belonged not necessarily to the brave or skilled, but to the side with better systems, more resources, superior logistics. This was the future of warfare that emerged in the Philippine Sea, a future of smart bombs and stealth aircraft and network-centric operations, of victories achieved through technical superiority and overwhelming coordination rather than traditional martial virtues. The Japanese pilots who flew into that maelstrom on June 19 were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They were simply on the wrong side of an industrial gap so vast that no amount of individual heroism could bridge it. They were turkeys sent against a harvesting machine, and the outcome was ordained by factors far beyond their control. There is a final detail, small but illuminating, that captures something essential about that day. Among the aircraft shot down in the Turkey Shoot was a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber piloted by Warrant Officer Masahiro Takeda. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the sea within sight of the American fleet. Takeda survived the crash and managed to inflate his life raft. An American destroyer, the Stockholm, diverted to pick him up, a routine combat rescue. As the destroyer approached, a sailor threw Takeda a line. Takeda grabbed it, was hauled aboard, and collapsed on the deck, coughing seawater and blood. The Americans gave him a blanket, medical attention, water to drink. This small act of mercy, routine for American forces, astonished Takeda. He had been taught that Americans would torture prisoners, that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Instead, he found himself treated with clinical compassion, catalogued as a prisoner, eventually sent to a camp where he would spend the remainder of the war in relative comfort, eating better meals than the civilians in Tokyo, receiving medical care superior to what most Japanese soldiers ever saw. In his post-war memoirs, Takeda would write that this experience, the gap between what he had been promised about the enemy and the reality of American treatment, shattered his ideological framework more completely than the military defeat itself. He had expected monsters and found merely men, professional sailors doing their jobs with brutal efficiency but without cruelty. This cognitive dissonance, replicated thousands of times across the Pacific theater, may have been the most destabilizing revelation of all. That the enemy was not the dehumanized other of propaganda, but rather the embodiment of a different approach to modernity, one that had proven devastatingly superior. The Turkey Shoot ended as twilight descended over the Philippine Sea, but its implications echoed forward through the remaining 14 months of the Pacific War. Every subsequent battle, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, unfolded in the shadow of that June day, when American naval aviation achieved such complete dominance that combat became slaughter. The Japanese would mount desperate defenses, would innovate kamikaze tactics born of technological inferiority, would fight with suicidal determination in island caves and jungle strongpoints, but they could not rebuild what had been destroyed in the Philippine Sea. The institutional knowledge, the trained pilots, the carrier aviation capability that had once made Japan a formidable naval power, all of this died over the course of 2 days in June 1944. What remained was defiance without hope, resistance without purpose, courage expended in service of a defeat that everyone except the most deluded fanatics could see coming. In the decades after the war, veterans of both sides would sometimes meet at reunions and commemorations. American pilots who had participated in the Turkey Shoot would shake hands with surviving Japanese aviators, would share drinks, would compare memories of that day. These encounters were often awkward, shot through with unspoken tensions. How do you reconcile shooting a man out of the sky with buying him a beer 40 years later? How do you explain that the ease of killing him haunted you more than any difficult victory? The Japanese veterans, for their part, struggled with different demons. The shame of comprehensive defeat, the guilt of survival when so many comrades died, the uncomfortable knowledge that they had been sacrificed to institutional delusions and strategic fantasies. But occasionally, in these encounters, something like understanding emerged. They had all been young men once, doing what their nations demanded, caught in forces beyond their control. The Turkey Shoot had been terrible not because men fought badly, but because systems functioned exactly as designed, because industrial warfare had achieved its logical conclusion in the reduction of combat to systematic killing. The sky above the Philippine Sea holds no memorials. The water preserves no monuments. The pilots who died there, Japanese and American alike, rest in unmarked graves 3 miles beneath the surface, their bones scattered across the abyssal plain, their names recorded only in logbooks and casualty lists. But their deaths mattered, not for any transcendent purpose or glorious sacrifice, but because they marked a turning point in the character of modern warfare. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated that victory in industrial conflict goes to the side that can build, sustain, and employ the most sophisticated systems, regardless of traditional martial virtues. Courage matters, skill matters, but in the final calculus, logistics and training and technological integration matter more. This was the lesson of the 19th of June, 1944, purchased at the cost of 600 Japanese lives and written in burning aircraft across the Pacific sky. It was not a lesson that any nation wanted to learn. It remains a lesson that no nation can afford to ignore. The sun sets now over the Philippine Sea, much as it did 80 years ago, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. The waves roll on, indifferent to history, unmarked by the slaughter they once witnessed. But beneath the surface, in the cold darkness 3 miles down, the debris field remains twisted, aluminum, shattered glass, the skeletal remains of aircraft that fell from the sky in minutes. These relics of the Turkey Shoot rest in permanent twilight, monuments to the men who flew them and to the terrible efficiency of modern war. They remind us that victory is not always glorious, that superiority can manifest as slaughter, that the ease of killing may haunt us more than the difficulty of combat. In the end, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not a battle. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept, an object lesson in what happens when industrial might meets martial tradition. The sky turned into a killing field that June day, and hundreds of young men learned too late that they had arrived at the wrong war, in the wrong decade, on the wrong side of history's inexorable mathematics.